Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I do appreciate my friend, Congressman Al Green. We are friends, and people have said, what do you have in common with Al Green? Well, actually, he is my brother. We are Christian brothers, and he adds significantly to this body, and I'm proud to be his brother. Slavery does shock the conscience, and I agree. It is really a crime against humanity. I remember after, and it's still going on. It's happening across our southern border. It's horrendous what's happening to some of the people that are being sex trafficked. We saw it in Nigeria after the 250 plus girls were kidnapped by Boko Haram from a Christian girls' school and handcuffed to beds, according to some of the stories that girls had escaped, repeatedly raped day after day. They were just horrendous conditions. I've been asked to fly over and meet with some of the parents of the girls that were kidnapped. And we had to go out a few hours from the city to a safe house. Met with, turned out, no fathers, all mothers. And I asked the pastor that was there with them during a break in our meeting, where are all the fathers? And he said, that's part of the tragedy. The fathers don't feel like they did their job as a father since their daughter was abducted and they knew was being made to perform actions, chained, handcuffed to beds, being raped every day repeatedly. The fathers didn't feel like they had done their job, that they deserved to have a home and a bed. So they went out into the bush, and as I understood later on, many of them had died out there. It was tragic. That's a form of slavery, horrendous. To think that's still going on, I was totally shocked. I thought humanity had advanced so far, and yet during the latter years of the Obama administration, we learned that in the world today, there are currently more slaves than ever in the history of the world. Over 40 million people in slavery. While the United States was a superpower. And President Obama, I know from the people in Nigeria, they told me they had word from the Obama administration that if Nigeria would legalize same-sex marriage and would provide abortions, legalize and provide abortions, then the United States would help Nigeria defeat Boko Haram. But as a very scrupulous, caring Catholic bishop in Nigeria said, our Christian beliefs are not for sale to the United States, to President Obama, or to John Kerry. We're not selling our Christian beliefs. That seemed pretty tragic, too, that we would basically try to compel people to go against their biblical beliefs so that they could get help removing children from slavery, sex slavery. I was surprised many years ago to find out, as a history major, I owed the Army 4 years, so I was going to be going there. So I loved math, was good at it. Biology, very interesting. Not as much to me botany, but I loved history and I majored in it. But it turned out that when the horrendous mistake, crime against humanity, whatever you want to call it, it's horrendous. That first ship brought slaves to America. It turns out they weren't the first slaves to North America. There were numerous cases of Indian tribes that would war with another tribe. They would kill many of the braves, the males, and often take women and children as slaves. It's something for which mankind should not be proud at all. There's even references in the Bible to people selling children to pay off their debts. Just tragic. So hopefully in days ahead we can do more to alleviate this crime against humanity that has grown substantially in the world today. I saw this article from the Washington Times. DHS released unvaccinated Afghans while threatening to fire unvaccinated Border Patrol. That seems grossly unfair to American law enforcement, kind of a war against law enforcement. We're going to force you, regardless of whether there is, we know that the vaccinations don't actually prevent the spread of COVID. That's science now. That should be clear. Even Fauci and President Biden have admitted that what they thought was originally true was not. It doesn't prevent people from getting COVID. We're told, it keeps it from being as serious unless you happen to get myocarditis or one of the other terrible side effects that have been found to occur. Then we got Secretary Mayorkas maintaining the border is secure. And while he's saying the border is secure, we have had millions of people come across illegally just since President Biden's been in office. Then, a big headline recently has been the big Democrat donor Sam Bankman-Fried, SBF, some call him, the founder of FTX, second largest contributor to the Democrat-affiliated political action committees, they've gone, the company he founded, dealing in cryptocurrency, FTX, it's gone bankrupt, and he's gone out of business. But you have a letter that was prepared by one of our Republican colleagues to Secretary Blinken, and it points out, it's come to our attention that millions of taxpayer dollars sent to Ukraine to assist with their war efforts were potentially invested in a crypto exchange that then made massive donations to Democrats in the United States during the 2022 midterm elections. In March 2022, the Ukrainian the Ukrainian government officially and for the first time partnered with crypto exchange FTX Trading Limited to launch a crypto donations website, Aid for Ukraine it was called, within days of President Joe Biden pledging billions of tax dollars to assist the country with war efforts against the Russian invasion. And it goes on to say the Ukrainian government also invested portions of the $54 billion of U.S. economic assistance. They invested that in FTX also, that helped keep Democrats in the power they retain. But anyway, this is just incredibly outrageous. So there are answers being demanded, and Secretary Blinken will need to respond, and I feel sure that he'll be called as a witness shortly after the first of the year. I hate to think that with all the suffering going on in Ukraine, that some of that money intended to help them ended up helping FTX before he went broke, and obviously some of his money went to the Democrat campaigns. So we'll see what's going on there. But I have made a dear friend since I've been in Congress, and he has been co-chair of the Thursday morning prayer breakfast, and he is a friend, and he's a fine person, and I will yield such time as Mr. Swayze will use.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the gentleman from Texas for yielding 1 minute, and I just wanted to enter into the record a poem by an American poet who happened to live in my district in the 1800s. And this poem was brought to my attention by my sister, Rosemary Lloyd, the poem was brought to her attention by a historian from my college, Boston College, Heather Cox Richardson. And in this poem, Walt Whitman talked about America's choosing day. And we see the confrontation, the divisions that we have in our country right now. But in 1884, there were great divisions in this country, less than 20 years after the Civil War. And there was great disruption among the political parties to decide how we would move forward. But I want to read Whitman's poem into the record because it will be a great guidance to all of us for today. If I should need to name, O Western world, your powerfulest scene and show, 'twould not be you, Niagara, nor ye limitless prairies, nor your huge rifts of canyons, Colorado, nor you, Yosemite, nor Yellowstone, with all its spasmic geysers, loops ascending to the skies, appearing and disappearing, nor Oregon's white cones, nor Huron's belt of mighty lakes, nor Mississippi's stream. This seething hemisphere's humanity, as now I'd name the still small voice vibrating, America's choosing day. The heart of it, not in the chosen, the act itself, the main, the quadrennial choosing, the stretch of north and south aroused, seaboard and inland, Texas to Maine, the prairie states, Vermont, Virginia, California, the final ballot shower from east to west, the paradox and conflict, the countless snowflakes falling, a swordless conflict, yet more than all of Rome's wars of old or modern Napoleon's, the peaceful choice of all. Or good or ill humanity, welcoming the darker odds, the dross, foams and ferments the wine, it serves to purify while the heart pants, life glows. These stormy gusts and winds waft precious ships, swelled Washington's, Jefferson's, Lincoln's sails. America's choosing day, the act itself. I thank the gentleman from Texas, and I yield back.
Thank my friend, and my apologies if calling you my friend gets you in trouble. Thank you. He is a friend. An article in the Epoch Times by Joseph Hanneman. Judge's latest refusal to grant bail looms large for January 6th defendant maced twice by D.C. jail guard. Having been a felony judge in Texas, handling, I don't know how many thousands of felony cases, nobody gets more incensed than I do when judges abuse their position. I recall having a bailiff. I found out that during recesses, he was trash-mouthing, talking terrible to people that I was sentencing. And when I found out, I called him in and said, look, I'm sentencing these people to prison. We are supposed to show the example of civility. When you trash talk somebody when they come into court, it builds up hatred and anger, and they seethe during the time they're in prison, and it makes them more likely to come back and recidivate. There's no reason to do that. We're going to treat them civilly and fairly and make sure they're not abused, not verbally, not physically. And yet I see federal judges who seem to have the attitude that, gee, I am confirmed for life, so once I'm confirmed, I will do as I please and as I think I can get away with on appeal, and it's outrageous. So I'm encouraging my friends on the Judiciary Committee that there is such abuse by federal judges. There is such abuse by the DOJ and by the FBI adopting Gestapo tactics. They didn't used to act like that. I've had so many FBI agents tell me, you remember how it was in the 80s and 90s. We didn't go break down doors of people we knew would show up voluntarily if we just told them when and where. We didn't do it in the middle of the night to scare families and drag them out in their underwear and alert the news media so they'd be there to humiliate them. And yet, it's been going on. And people say January 6th and think that justifies the worst criminality by the Department of Justice and even federal judges. Because I do believe it is a breach of a federal judge's oath when they ignore due process requirements. And they take the position, I'm not going to do anything about somebody that's being abused in jail until I'm told to by an appellate court. So I'm hoping that the Judiciary Committee will even be subpoenaing judges to find out, not belabor specific cases, but to find out what their judicial philosophy is that allows them to avoid due process and to allow prisoners to be punished in pretrial confinement against the constitutional rights they have. What allows and provokes a federal judge to act like a dictator in their courtroom? Here's an example. I would not know U.S. District Judge Emmett Sullivan if he was here in the room, but I have read and heard firsthand from people who have had to deal with some of the injustice of him. And I know the federal judge that refused to recuse himself so he could sentence Dr. Simone Gold, even though he dated her and she wouldn't date him anymore. So he looked forward to abusing his position to sentence her as the first woman with no criminal record and only guilty of a misdemeanor trespass. He got to sentence the girl that quit going out with him, the woman the brilliant lawyer and MD, to a maximum security facility down in Miami. He needs to come in and answer about recusal and who he thinks he is above the law that's in the law, that a judge must recuse himself or herself if there's even an indication there might be some impartiality there. We got a lot of cleaning up in the federal system to do, and I am glad that Republicans will be able to do that. The article points out, despite audio and video evidence showing former Tennessee Sheriff's Deputy Ronald Colton McAbee did not assault a police officer on the Capitol steps of January 6, as alleged by prosecutors, a federal judge again refused the defendant's motion to be released from the District of Columbia jail pending trial. The issue took on added urgency on September 5th when McAbee, 28, was twice assaulted with chemical spray by a guard in the District of Columbia jail for not wearing a COVID mask. His wife, Sarah, told the Epoch Times, "This is just inhumane," Sarah McAbee said. "Doesn't even matter what your political beliefs are. You should never treat somebody that way. Are we living in the same universe? This is not the America I once knew." McAbee is charged by federal prosecutors with 7 January 6 related crimes: assaulting, resisting, or impeding a federal officer, 2 counts of civil disorder, entering and remaining in a restricted building or grounds with a deadly or dangerous weapon, disorderly or disruptive conduct in a restricted building or grounds with a deadly or dangerous weapon, engaging in physical violence in a restricted building or grounds with a deadly or dangerous weapon, and committing an act of physical violence in the Capitol grounds or building. And that sounds horrible. But then when you find out that actually, if you listen to the audio as you watch the video, you find out he was helping a Capitol policeman who was down. And yet this judge has the audacity to say, we're not listening to the audio, so he could hear that evidence. Why wouldn't you listen to the evidence as well as watch a video that gives a false impression? Why? And then to chastise this guy and punish him even more because he was law enforcement. He should have known better than to assault a police officer, but he wasn't. Well, the judge doesn't want the facts to get in the way. He's too busy being a tyrant and punishing January 6 defendants while they're in pretrial and punishing them with pretrial. People need to answer for the tyranny of our justice system as it's become. And I have no problem, and I didn't as a judge, punishing people who deserve the punishment. And there were people January 6th that deserved to be punished. But it sounds like that corruption continues to grow in the DOJ, the FBI, and even in our judicial courts, federal courts. Tragic. He'd been pepper sprayed in the jail twice and was not allowed to clean it all off. It's a threat to his health. In a 31-page, oh, and by the way, this sat in front of the judge, the request for bail, 117 days. Now, in our state courts, we make sure somebody has a hearing. We used to, I'm sure they still do, within 48 hours. And if they had other evidence to bring in, we'd set a hearing and have that. But this judge had this matter sitting in front of him for 117 days while the prisoner was being abused in the D.C. jail, where there was a deputy warden that had tweeted out, "F the supporters of Trump." Well, she made sure what she tweeted was what was being done at the jail. So Judge Sullivan took 69 days after the hearing to issue a ruling on whether somebody should stay in jail or not. What kind of judge is that? And then he dismissed the new video and audio evidence, calling them ambiguities the court could not resolve. Well, apparently the only reason he had the hearing in the first place was because the U.S. Court of Appeals was going to require it if he didn't do it. So he did it, but grudgingly. But this matter had gone before a U.S. magistrate in Middle District of Tennessee, and he heard the evidence, saw the evidence, and he ordered Maccabee to be released to home detention pending trial after hearings were had in August, early September 2021. That judge said, quote, "I do not believe that Mr. Maccabee poses a future danger to the community if he were to be released between now and the time that he resolves this case. And the government, despite my request that they provide me any evidence that he's presented any sort of a danger to the community, have been able to point to absolutely nothing beyond the events around and during January 6th. Well, prosecutors knew they had to get that matter away from the judge in Tennessee, where there was more evidence of who Maccabee really was to the core. So they got it up here to Judge Sullivan, who immediately rescinded that order and kept him in jail as punishment, despite the requirement to the contrary by the U.S. Constitution. It really is outrageous. You know, if a judge were deciding whether Judge Sullivan breached his sworn oath, that judge could say exactly what Judge Sullivan said to Maccabee. Judge Sullivan said, "Someone tasked with enforcing the law has shirked that responsibility, and that's why they're dangerous." Well, it sounds kind of like that's where Judge Sullivan is. He has shirked his responsibility to the law and the Constitution, and that's why he's a dangerous judge. And I hope they'll have hearings and get to the bottom of what his problems are with following the Constitution. Now, last summer, well, there were a number of times I have met Pastor Tommy Nelson of Denton Bible Church in Denton, Texas. I've listened years ago to hours and hours of Bible study he did. I'm very impressed with him. I love the fact that he loves history so much, and he uses that as he speaks. And I'd heard him online doing sermons to his church, and he would kid and say, "And I'm going to include that when I get to speak to Congress someday." So I talked to Tommy, and I said, "Look, you know, you're not going to be able to come in and talk to Congress as Tommy Nelson, but I can pass on your messages." We quote people all the time. Put together what you think would be good to have Congress hear, and I'll deliver that. And Tommy provided me this information that his father was born in 1914. And these are Tommy's words. "If you'd asked my father if one should steal, kill, cheat on his taxes, commit adultery, or lie, he would have said, absolutely not. If you'd asked him, why not? His father would have said, because it's wrong. If you responded, says who? He would have said, God. If you said, where does God say it's wrong? He would have said, the Bible. If you ask for an explanation, how do you know it's true? He could not have given much of a defense of biblical authority. But in his worldview, like most of his generation, it was that of a Western or Judeo-Christian worldview. He connected all the dots of diversity within the unity of an infinite personal God who had spoken truly to all mankind through his word, the Bible, and had intersected man through the Bible's chief idea, the incarnation of God in his Son, Jesus Christ. The God we speak of, actually, I'm glad to say, is the one mentioned right up there, in God we trust, because we used to. Tommy said, if you had said to any of that greatest generation, truth is something relative to what you want it to be, or there is no final truth, not only would there be wonderment at you, but anger. They would have seen you as a threat to their day. Wisdom to that generation and every generation of Americans before them was to know the truth. And to follow the will of God as truth was not simply the way that was true, but the way that was best. Truth that carried them through the hardest century of our history. Now, that former view is seen as antiquated, as though greater minds have progressed beyond that. That former view is now seen as that which holds back the growth of society. But the belief in oughtness, in moral truth, is the marvelous byproduct of belief in the true God. It was Plato who said, in life we must seek the best opinions of men and hold to them as to a boat in a storm, unless we have a more certain word from God. The idea of God, the Bible, Christ the Redeemer, is the highest dream of the hopes of men. We can know what must be known to truly be mankind. Morality, marriage, the home, the dignity of man, the meaning of love, right and wrong, all are revealed on that which was the foundation of our civilization, the Bible. It brought a worldview which was light and salt to our culture and our country. It brought law and order and dignity. It served as a point of integration to which all answered. Our only problem was our refusal to live in keeping with it. But our day has cut off the limb upon which we were sitting in our rejection of God, banning school prayer, permitting the murder of children in the womb, and abolishing traditional marriage. Modernism is the belief that God can be rejected and yet be replaced by the reasoning and science of man. Postmodernism is the recognition that modernism will not work, because postmodernism states that there is no such thing as absolute truth, and with God refused, society as we have known it disintegrates. The earthquake beneath our feet began in the country shift in the 1960s. The tsunamis followed, with each year more and more devastating. We are now worse than in the jungle. The jungle has natural law which governs it, but the law that governs man is God. Man, as in God's image, chooses. He can be angelic or demonic based on those choices. Without God and his word to guide man, his fallen nature is unleashed. And unlike nature, man has become more and more immoral, violent, ignorant, and cruel. And that's the horror that is sweeping our country day by day. And as it has laid waste to Europe, It is about to eliminate the greatest culture in the history of mankind, the Western culture, the Judeo-Christian worldview that sees all of life through the perspective of the God of the Bible, which we, the leaders of the United States as a body, have too often renounced. Washington's last words to us, George Washington's last words to us, were to be aware of following the path of Europe, a path that began in the exaltation of reason and science in the Enlightenment. We have not heeded his words, and now Europe's inhumanities of the 20th century have become ours. I need not spend much time on the violence, contempt of authority, breakdown of the home, violence in our cities, decay of our educational system, the division of our leaders and citizens, pornography, STDs, 65 million dead through abortion, gender confusion, illegal immigration, drug addiction, opioids, loss of constitutional freedoms, the homeless, the increase of mental illnesses, pedophilia, gun control, racial tensions, not to speak of the economy and COVID. And yet in all this plethora of dysfunction, the terms God, righteousness, sin, repentance, Jesus Christ, the Bible, and salvation are forbidden terms. We cry over what ain't right, and yet offer nothing but Band-Aids and tourniquets. Man must be changed. His heart must be changed at the deepest level. He must have a new birth. He must be born again as a child of God. He must, as Nineveh in the days of Jonah, repent and heed the warning of God that destruction awaits. Our country and its leaders must humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways that God may hear our prayer, forgive our sins, and heal our land. We must be reconciled to him who is our life and being. It starts with us, the God-ordained leaders, but sadly repentance cannot be legislated. It begins in revival. It begins in the yearning of individuals who have cast off the blinders of modern man and faced the truth that there can be no truth, right, love, or life without the unique personal God of the Bible. Tommy Nelson referenced quote from Alexis de Tocqueville. I want to provide some with thanks to William Federer's research and publication. There's much to be learned from Alexis de Tocqueville. He was born July 29th, 1805. He was a French social scientist. He traveled the United States in 1831 and wrote a two-part work, Democracy in America, 1835, and then the second in 1840, which has been described as, quote, the most comprehensive and penetrating analysis of the relationship between character and society in America that has ever been written. In it, de Tocqueville said, upon my arrival in the United States, the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck my attention. And the longer I stayed, the more I perceived the great political consequences resulting from this new state of things to which I was unaccustomed. In France, I'd almost always seen the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom marching in opposite directions. But in America, I found they were intimately united and that they reigned in common over the same country. He also said they brought with them a form of Christianity, which I cannot better describe than by styling it as a democratic and Republican religion. From the earliest settlement of the immigrants, politics and religion contracted with an alliance which has never been dissolved. That was Alexis de Tocqueville's note back in the 1800s. He said, religion in America must be regarded as the foremost of the political institutions of that country. For if it does not impart a taste for freedom, it facilitates the use of it. This opinion is not peculiar to a class of citizens or party, but it belongs to the whole nation. De Tocqueville says, the sects that exist in the United States, that's SECTS, are innumerable. They all differ in respect to the worship which is due to the Creator, but they all agree in respect to the duties which are due from man to man. Each sect adores the deity in its own peculiar manner, but all sects preach the same moral law in the name of God. Moreover, as the sects of the United States are comprised within the great unity of Christianity, and Christian morality is everywhere the same. De Tocqueville also said, in the United States, the sovereign authority is religious. There's no country in the whole world where the Christian religion retains a greater influence than in America. And inserting parenthetically, that drove and led to the Civil War. There were so many people that are going, wait a minute, we can't treat brothers and sisters with chains and bondage. And yes, I understand some fought for states' rights. But let's face it, it was about slavery for most. De Tocqueville said, in the United States, religion is not confined to the manners, but it extends to the intelligence of the people. Christianity, therefore, reigns without obstacle by universal consent. He's talking about America. He said, the Americans combine the notions of Christianity and of liberty so intimately in their minds that it is impossible to make them conceive the one without the other. And with them, this conviction does not spring from that barren traditionary faith which seems to vegetate in the soul rather than to live. In Book 2 of his Democracy in America, de Tocqueville wrote, Christianity has therefore retained a stronghold on the public mind in America. In the United States, Christianity itself is a fact so irresistibly established that no one undertakes either to attack or to defend it. Wow, things have changed. Tommy Nelson points out, remember the words of the atheist John Paul Sartre. Without an infinite reference point by which all things are judged, all singular points are meaningless. Without God, all of life disintegrates. It has always amused me that in 1789, two historical events occurred simultaneously: the American Constitution in Philadelphia and the French Revolution in Paris, both representing opposite worldviews. The American Constitution, though not uniquely Christian, reflected the historic Christian worldview of, quote, nature's God and the, quote, inalienable right of life and liberty. It gave birth to a culture that France honored in their sending us the Statue of Liberty because of our country being so successful. Not because of our revolution, but because of our Constitution. Revolutions are relatively easy. They're simply tearing down. What is difficult is rebuilding. The French had their revolution, but their replacement was not a document that reflected the Bible. It was a culture that reflected French enlightenment, atheism that replaced God with nature, science, and unaided reason. With no divine standard, it collapsed into a socialistic bloodbath that prompted a new term, guillotine. All of Europe would follow, and by 1848, the year of revolution, all European monarchies were gone. But in France, without the God of truth, the replacement failed, only to be conquered by a dictator to bring order, Napoleon, who plunged Europe into darkness. And let me add, I agree with historians that have said the major difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution was the American Revolution, like Tommy Nelson points out. It was about liberty that stemmed from biblical belief, whereas the French Revolution was about revenge. And we see how that worked out. But the same would happen in Russia, who exchanged the church for the communism of Marx and Lenin, and finally the horror of Stalin, tens of millions killed. Germany had Hitler, China had Mao, Cuba had Castro. But as a Russian pastor has said, Russia is a nation of darkness looking for the light. America is a country of the light, searching for the darkness. Our search has sadly been successful. The Christian philosopher and author Francis Schaeffer said, "Where there is no absolute to govern society, society is absolute. There's nothing magic about democracy or government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It assumes that the majority of the voting public has the wisdom and character to place worthy men and women in places of authority. Should that society over time abandon their historic worldview and adopt a modern one where truth is shaped by individual opinions? Or should that society reject God and enthrone man? Then absolute divine law will erode with each generation until the tyranny of the majority removes the freedom enjoyed by the past. And considering the influence of modern media, the majority will be controlled by the few. And the America of history will be just that, past history. To abandon God is to disintegrate. Imagine, if you will, a great metal machine operated by man. The parts are sharp and pointed, moving with great speed and perfect synchronization. Anything that would get caught in the machine would be ground into nothingness within seconds. As long as the man's operating the machine is careful to stay outside of the machine, he's safe. But should he catch a shirt sleeve in the gears, he will soon disintegrate. Such is man and the universe. And he stands unique in God's image outside of nature. Man can observe the machine, use it, and marvel at it, but should he become part of the impersonal, he is ground into mulch. Such is man and nature. Though part of the creation, man stands infinitely distinct from it as in the image of God. As distinct from the impersonal machine, man maintains his glory, but to be merely part of nature, all of the glory of man, mind, reason, conscience, soul, and will merely become biological phenomena. The loftiness and magic of man is lost in the machine of nature. King David wrote, "When I consider the heavens and the works of thy hands, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Yet thou hast made him for a little while lower than the angels, that dost crown him with glory and majesty, and thou dost appoint him over the works of thy hands." And these are the hands that America has rejected. Man without God is a cosmic orphan, with no one who gives him meaning, care, or hope of redemption or life after death. There is no way, truth, or life without God. John 3:16 evaporates in that circumstance. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Man may act atheistic, wise, and secular, but he cannot react as an atheist. As soon as he is sinned against or done unjustly, He becomes a Puritan longing for an injustice to receive absolute retribution. Without God, the only thing man can feel guilty about is guilt. Guilt assumes transgression, and transgression assumes law that assumes God. Without God, there can be no final law, guilt, or true government, no civility to build a civilization, no cult or religious rules to build culture. We cannot legislate a return to truth. 150 years of governmental, academic, artistic, scientific, philosophic, moral, domestic, medical, education, and judicial denial cannot be naturally fixed. We are beyond hope for a return. We are too stubborn and too proud, too self-centered, too indulged. Our only hope is the divine reprieve of Nineveh in the day of Jonah. A prophet who rose from the dead promised life or destruction in 40 days upon their response to his prophecy of destruction. From the king to the people and even to the animals, a fast was called for, and all wore sackcloth. The disaster was averted, and so it is now. Prophets who rise from the dead after 3 days and nights are not to be disregarded. If indeed man has judged rightly for 20 centuries that there is an infinite and personal God who has revealed himself in the Bible, the foundation of history's greatest culture, who raised his son from the dead to offer man repentance and salvation. If he is indeed a God of wrath upon those countries who hold him in contempt, then our country revels today in the shadow of Vesuvius. Jeremiah 48:42, Moab will be destroyed from being a people because he has magnified himself against the Lord. Icarus may fly high with his wings of wax, but should hubris carry him too high, his wings will melt, his feathers fly to the wind, and he shall come to a violent end. May those who have ears to hear take heed, repent, reform accordingly. You know, Tommy Nelson has profound truth that he has provided. But that's because it comes from truth beyond him, which he readily acknowledges. You know, Dostoevsky was quoted by Solzhenitsyn. I'd not seen the quote before. Solzhenitsyn used it in the Gulag Archipelago. Dostoevsky was taking on the crazy ideas of this nut named Marx, a sad man, sad family, who couldn't even foresee the formation of unions. And Dostoevsky said the big problem with Marxism is not economic. Obviously, that's a problem. They always go broke eventually. The problem with Marxism is atheism. And I hear some of my colleagues talk about how wonderful progressivism is. That's the new term for Marxism. How great it will be when everybody shares and shares alike. But as Khrushchev found when he set up a commission to come up with a plan of how you move to true communism, where there's no government, everybody shares and shares alike, he ended up disbanding the commission because there's no way to ever get to a place until the Messiah comes. It won't happen because you've got to have a totalitarian government that takes away everybody's rights and tells them what they will be allowed to do and not do, and that government becomes the God. And that's what Dostoevsky was saying. So I won't be back next year. I'll be back in 2 weeks and the week after that, Mr. Speaker. But I continue to have hope that springs eternal in the human breast, that we won't lose the greatest freedom, the greatest country, the greatest gift of a country any people has ever received, that it will not be our generation that sees it lost. And with that, I yield back.